The number one things that I get asked, and especially when it's planting season, because you know right now is the 5th garden season. It's the planting season, and people just really want to know, they have a hard time, myself included, is how much do I plant? But like, how much do I know how to plant? And I kind of came up with a method last year. I did a video about it, but I tried it this year. I want to go through it again and see, first of all, if it'll help any of you guys, but how it really worked out. I realize today is Halloween, and it's a couple days before Halloween right now, but my chickens are actually carving my pumpkin for me. So we'll see how they do. Looks like we're gonna have 3 or 4 eyes, that's for sure. I gave them a template. They didn't follow directions, but look, I like Halloween, but I don't like carving pumpkins, so this is the way to go, hopefully. We'll see, could be a new trend for me for the years to come. But welcome back to Sandy Bottom Homestead. Hope you all, ladies and gentlemen, are having an absolutely fantastic day. You know, first of all, I'm in coastal North Carolina, so let's get that out of the way. There you go. There's a lot to this. It's a difficult thing, and it's hard when you make the switch from going from a hobbyist gardener to really producing food. Knowing how much to produce is really difficult. We can go in the garden right now, and you know, this time of year it's actually really easy for the most part. I mean, you know, how many heads of broccoli do you want? How many cabbages do you want? How many rutabagas do you want? How many radishes do you want? All of these plants produce one plant produces one harvest. Look, I know that broccoli gives you side shoots. I'm not a side shoot fan, so cut it out. It's all about the head for me, you know what I'm saying? Especially this time of year. When the head goes, it's already getting too cold, so there's not really a lot of side shoot action, but you know, lettuce, it's kind of, you know, how many heads of lettuce do you want? Kale, you know, kind of, it is what it is. Now, there's a couple things for this time of year and in the spring that you can make a smaller planting stretch further. The first thing is, if we come over here to this garden bed, we've got our kale and our collards, and we've got our lettuces. Now this time of year I harvest differently for my lettuce. I do cut and come again, so I'll cut the outside edges and then leave them, they'll grow. I do every other plant, and then we'll get a harvest. In the spring I take the whole head because it's just gonna bolt really fast anyways, so we'll do that. So you know, in this time of year, one row will get us through. Now we only have 3 kale plants, but the reason why is because we do the cut and come again as well, and that'll typically handle us pretty good. Same with our collards. You know, you're not taking the whole plant. This really makes a big difference. It makes it so you can have a plant go further, because if we were just to plant our lettuces, or let's take that back, if we were just to plant kale and just let it grow and then cut the whole plant, we would need a whole bed of kale. But we can get away with 3, 4, 5 plants, you know, let's just call it a row. We can get away with a row of kale and we'll have plenty to eat. Truth be told, we probably need a little bit more, but I'm not worried about it. So those are pretty easy. But then you get into other things like our Brussels sprouts, our tomatoes, our bell peppers, our hot peppers, cucumbers, green beans, squashes, melons, you know, all of these plants, okras, anything that one plant will produce multiple fruits on can be really confusing. And the reason why I wanted to really hammer this down is simply because the more squash plants I put in, the less space I have for something else. I mean, I'm growing in a compact garden, as most people are, and so space is a premium, right? I mean, if you pay for your yard, you know, each square foot of your yard costs X amount of dollars. So we look at it that way and we say, well, we want to get as much as we can in this small area, so what can we do to really help this? And figuring out how much to plant really makes a difference, because you could go from one full bed of squash down to a half a row. So we did this whole bed of squash this year, and that worked out really good. And we actually, this bed which we're going to use, we did Brussels sprouts in, is where I started using this method, and then we went into squash and continued to use this method, and it worked out pretty good. before we get into that method, I wanted to do a little bit of a story time. My dad's got a friend, and he's got apparently a rather large garden, and he shows up with a 5-gallon bucket of squash, and he's like, just take it. And you know, they're like, well, I don't really need that much squash. He's like, man, I got so much, I'm just throwing it out, just take it. That's a problem we don't want to have. First of all, you don't want to be forcing vegetables on anybody, because I mean, people just aren't going to eat them. If you're to give me vegetables and I'm not going to eat them, I don't want to throw them out. That's your problem. 2, all of that space that's used up for that squash could be used for something else much different. And you could probably diversify your garden, grow something new, grow something more productive, grow something long lasting, cover crop it so you can build the soil. There's so many different options. And so this was really important to me, that I didn't want to be in that situation where I'm basically just throwing food at people. All right, we're in the swing, so you know we're about to get down and dirty with it. So this is going to take a little bit of math, and I don't like to do math in public because it makes me look stupid, but we're going to give it a shot. So I just Googled on my phone, how much squash does one plant produce? Okay, now it doesn't stop there, so don't just say, oh, that's it. And you go, well, I mean, if you want to, fine, but there's that. Then there's a lot of different variables. Okay, so we're going to use Brussels sprouts as one and squash as one, and there's a reason why. So for the squash, you get roughly, don't shoot me, roughly, 5 to 8 squash per plant. So think to yourself, how much do I want? Well, what do we know about squash? Well, first of all, squash, it gets squash vine borer, and it dies, okay? So you're typically cutting the life short, but on top of that, it kind of has a lifespan. It doesn't just grow and grow and grow. It'll grow, it'll put on fruit, and then it could go dormant for a while, and you could keep it alive, and then it could grow more fruit. But let's just say it's gonna grow, and then it's gonna go dormant or whatever. The squash vine borer is gonna get it, we're gonna pull it, okay? I feel fairly confident that, let's keep it at an even number, 5 squash will actually be produced from this plant. So if that's the case, and you know that your family loves squash, and you eat squash every day, well, you're gonna need to plant a bunch of plants. So if we get 5 squash from plant, and you wanna eat it every day throughout the whole summer, you're gonna need to keep a rotation of squash going, okay? But it doesn't, and just stop there. What I typically do is I say, well, first of all, squash needs pollination, right? One plant will absolutely, because they have male and female flowers, they will produce, but it's a lot easier to have multiple plants because you have multiple chances. And look, before I get the question, if you're only getting male flowers, give it time, it will put off female flowers. They always start with the male and then the female comes behind it. That's just the way it works, because you gotta have the sperm to fertilize the egg, right? I mean, we're going back to the birds and bees. So that's kind of how that works. So once we get that, and we know that like multiple plants is really better, then you say, my family's intake is gonna be X amount per week. We wanna have, and like my mom, she'll eat squash every meal. I don't like it that much. It's actually not anywhere near that. But let's say I want to eat it twice a week, and my family eats 2 squash a meal. Then I know that one plant will give me 2 weeks worth of food, okay? So 2 weeks worth of food per plant. Now that's if fertilization is good, watering is good, pollination is good, the pest pressure is low, no disease, stuff like that. So what I like to do, and squash is, I'll be a little bit more lenient because of the way I plant it. And the trick with squash is you plant it earlier, and then you can get your harvest before your squash vine borer hatches. I'll cut it back to 4 squash per plant. And that's what I expect to get. Now, in my experience, I've gotten way more than 4 squash per plant, but that'll help me set this number in my head. So if we know that our squash in our area grows from, it'll produce, not grow, but produce from May, and we can squeeze into July, and we want 2 squash per week, or 4 squash per week, let's say. No, my family wants to have it 1 meal a week with squash. I would say that I need 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 4 weeks in a month. So we need 8 squash a month. And that would be 2 plants. So if we want to have 2 months worth of squash, then we need 4 plants. Now, if we want to go longer than that, now we get into succession sowing. Okay, so what we can expect from that is to have a lull where we're not eating squash, and then it'll kick back in. So we may get a little break, right? So you can do it that way, but I always build in that kind of safety zone of like something's not going to go right. And I always plant about 10 to 20% more. So to keep numbers simple, if I put 10 plants in, then I'll put an extra plant or 2 in typically. And that will set us in the right direction. It's for a fruiting, pollinating plant, which we don't have any out here except for this Seminole pumpkin. But let's talk about these Brussels sprouts now. So this is a totally different plant. It's very, very hard to judge what you're gonna get off of it. They're doing well right now, by the way. We're actually starting to put size on. I'm fertilizing as we speak through the injector. So we should expect to see a little push in growth soon. But let's say that we want to eat Brussels sprouts. Now my family loves Brussels sprouts. We eat a lot of Brussels sprouts, minimum 2 times a week, minimum in the winter time, 2 times a week. Now, what we have to do, because Brussels sprouts are a little bit different, is you're not counting individual sprouts, so we're gonna go by poundage, right? So we know that if we go to the grocery store and we buy one of those little net bags of Brussels sprouts, then we're gonna get about a ½ a pound of Brussels sprouts, and that'll do us for a little side dish. If we wanna do a full meal, it's a pound. But we're gonna leave a full meal of them out and just say it's a ½ a pound for my family per meal. And we wanna eat it twice a week. So we need a pound a week for our Brussels sprouts, okay? Now we know that we can't just say, I want a pound and they're there. We have to actually grow it. We've gotta wait for these plants to grow and get to where we can harvest them. But when you think about that, there's a way to come up with how many plants you need, and it's a very similar method, but we've got to be more generous. So these plants are starting to get some height on them. We've actually got a little bit of pest pressure on a couple of them. We've been treating them. So right there, we know that like this plant, for instance, which is starting to get pest pressure, is going to struggle a little bit on the production side. I'm actually killing the cabbage moth worms as we speak. So if you Google it and you look at it, what we find is that Brussels sprouts will produce roughly a pound of Brussels sprouts per plant. So now we know that we have 28 plants in here. We stand to produce 28 pounds of Brussels sprouts. Is that gonna fill our needs of 1 pound per week? You know, we'll call it even, say we want 2 meals a week of it too. That's a really hard one. Now, if they all produce, then that gives us 28 weeks of Brussels sprouts. And the way that it works is you get a plant and it grows, you harvest it, you eat it, you let the other ones grow, you harvest it, you eat it, they keep in the fridge. So all of this plays into it completely. Now, if one plant produces a pound, what I do is I cut it back and I say, it's gonna produce 75% of that. At this time, it's gonna produce 75% of that. Now, last year I cut it in half because I've never really had a Brussels sprout harvest. This year, I feel like I figured out, so I upped it by about 25%. So we know we're gonna get 3/4 of a pound, or we estimate we're gonna get 3/4 of a pound per plant. Now, we're growing these at a time of year where we could have some loss, so we have to take that into account. So we know that we're gonna lose a number of these plants. How many, I don't know, I can't give you that number. But let's say we're gonna operate off the fact that we're gonna lose about 20%. So we have 28 plants. You do the math, I don't want to do it. So we're going to lose, I don't know, 3-4 plants probably. So that cuts us down from there. So then you start adding it all together, and then you can start getting your number up. Now, if you're starting a plant from scratch, you've never grown it before, cut that yield in half. If you're really good at it and you do it, go ahead. I wouldn't use the maximum yield, I would just cut it short. To account that these, you know, the weather is going to be an effect of this too, and we're having a very warm spring and our frost date is delayed at this point. So we are looking to where we're going to get a couple more weeks before frost even hits them, and as the weather cools they actually start growing better. So we start looking at that. Now we're looking at the time it is now, how long we have till the frost, the overall temperatures, and we look at the size of the plants, and we are actually a little bit behind, and they are starting to produce sprouts on the bottom. But what we really need is we need to get more height on it. So this is where your feeding comes in. So at this point we have to feed it more, and that's what's going to keep that going, keep that plant going, get that height on it, because everywhere this leaf connects all the way down is where you're going to get a Brussels sprout. So you can see right now, let's say that it just stopped and it went to fruit, we would get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 Brussels sprouts off this plant. We need to at minimum double to triple the size of this plant. So this plant needs to be here or here before we can really say that we're going to get that pound per Brussels sprouts. If we're going to say we're going to get a pound, it needs to be up this tall, you know, 3 times this size, and we're just not going to do that. So we know right now that we're already kind of touching at the 75% mark. We just do the math. How much is it going to be? How much do we need? If we want to eat a pound a week, and we know that we're limited to the growing season, so we can start harvesting these probably from January, maybe going into March. So over 3 months we can do it, and we know that they're going to store afterwards. So our final amount, my chicken was just freaking out, my final amount of time that we're going to have these available is basically from January to April. So that's 16 weeks. So we know that we're going to have enough if that's what we want. Now let's say you want to do something and you want to preserve, like let's look at this Seminole pumpkin. Well, this Seminole pumpkin got a life of its own, and it gave us so far 60 pumpkins, and it looks like we've got 5 or 6 more on there. So we're looking at about 60 to 70 pumpkins off this one plant. But what we know is that these pumpkins will store for 5 months afterwards. This is one plant. I don't need 2 plants. The last thing I need is 2 plants. As a matter of fact, I might not even grow it next year. I might be tired of eating it. And that's the other thing. You can rotate these things in and out. So take a look at your garden and see, like, and you really need to take and do an introspective on your diet and how you feel about how much of certain things you want to eat, and then go from there. And that's what's going to help you figure out how much you want to grow. It's really hard for me to sit here and say you need to grow 4 squash plants in order to have enough for your family. That's really hard because your family eats individualized compared to I do. You know, I don't eat yellow squash. It would do me no good. But I eat zucchini, I eat scallop squash, so that would work better, right? I don't eat tomatoes like a lot of people do. I'm trying to dance around the squash plant. I eat them in sauces and I cook with them and stuff like that, but I don't really eat them raw, so I don't need to grow as many. And everything goes the same. The thing is, you gotta look at varieties too. So tomato varieties will produce different. Determinants and indeterminants will produce different amounts at different times. Some places don't grow indeterminants well, some places do. So we need to figure all of that out. And it's about sitting down, doing the research, and applying it to your garden. And once you do that, you will start to figure it out, and each year you can dwindle down the number of plants you have, because I feel that our goal should be to waste as little as possible, because the #1 energy waste in this country is food waste. Calories and energy, and that is the #1 waste. And I don't think that we should be participating in that as gardeners. I think we should figure it out and really hone it down to basically almost a science.